Welcome to 2021 Sunstone Symposium, Session 152, On the Record, a comprehensive discussion of LDS-LGBTQ policy and messaging. At Sunstone, we are making it a goal to build a community that allows many ways for people to express their faith. Our tagline is, "There's more than one way to Mormon." We invite you to help us build a community where all paths are given space to be better understood. Please support us in our mission by making a donation and subscribing at sunstone.org. After the symposium, Sunstone staff will edit, polish, and re-upload all of this year's session videos to the Whova app. It'll take about 2 weeks for everything to be available, but once it is, every video will be available to watch and rewatch in the Whova app through the end of 2021. Please type any questions into the Whova app to be addressed during the Q&A, or if you're watching in person, we'll open the audience mic for questions at the end as time allows. About this presentation. In 2019, Kyle Ashworth released the On the Record project. On the Record is a detailed chronology of quotes and messaging about LGBTQIA+ issues from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The document shows the church's changing history and its treatment of queer people, helping us better understand why such a painful divide exists between the LGBTQIA+ and LDS communities. This presentation will both discuss how the church has mingled the philosophies of men with Scripture and what positive steps it has taken to address the queer experience. I'll take a second to introduce you to our speaker before we begin. Kyle Ashworth is the voice behind Latter Gay Stories. Latter Gay Stories is an LGBTQ podcast and website resource for those in and adjacent to the intersection of LGBTQ Street and LDS Avenue. Its mission is to bring visibility to the LGBTQ+ community and establish the value of queer experiences in society. Kyle actively supports many local LGBTQ organizations, and he currently sits on the N-Circle Advisory Board. He has previously served as president of the Affirmation Intermountain Region and in various community board positions. He's the father of 4 children. He and his partner, Jay, reside in Heber City. I'll now give the floor to Kyle.
And I will now use my abs to get up on the stage. To stretch. Welcome. I need to see how this is going to work a little better. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you to Sunstone for giving me the opportunity to present On the Record. This, fortunately, is the first time I have presented On the Record publicly, so consider yourself not only opportunistic, but guinea piggish. Today's presentation really will be kind of a fire hose experience. It'll be an opportunity to take in a whole lot of information all at once with my very best ability to try to give you some background and detail in the best way possible, but knowing that there's so much history to cover, essentially 200 years of Mormon history to cover on this topic in about an hour and 10 minutes time. So there will be plenty of spaces in between some of the quotes and some of the things that we talk about that we won't be able to jump in and dive into completely, but I do invite you to do that. And that's really the purpose of On the Record. I wish, just to give you a little bit of background about what On the Record is, as was mentioned in 2019, I published On the Record. It's been kind of a labor of love in typical Mormon fashion. The benefits of our work here on earth aren't felt on earth, but will be in the eternities. And that seemed to be what this On the Record project really was for me. It was so much work and so much studying and so much digging into our history. And I thought a lot of that was just for my own benefit. I really wanted to try to understand, as a gay man who grew up in the church, who navigated this relatively closeted my whole life, I really wanted to understand why there was so much hatred and persecution and dissonance in this topic when I just felt like I was normal, and I felt like I deserved the same things as my straight friends deserved, and that I wasn't as broken and and conditional as the church and maybe many of its members had led me to believe. So I wanted to understand the history. I wanted to understand why our traditions existed the way that they did. And so I just took a deep dive into the history. I wanted to study it out and figure out where the nuances were and where the pitfalls were. And it led me to starting to put together all of these in a spreadsheet, into a Word document, into a file that I could then kind of mitigate and manage through and try to maybe create a chronology. I worked on the record for about 3.5 years, so it was a lot of work. The most important thing, at that point I was also very Mormon, and I wanted to also source. My great Mormon brain told me it's not true unless you can point to the source, because everyone has a comment about something, but you always took it out of context, or that was not what Elder so-and-so said. So I knew that if I was going to create a convincing chronology, it had to be sourced as well. So a reader or myself could go back to the original documents and start finding out and read from the beginning all the way through the end exactly what that particular church leader was talking about. So that added a completely new layer to On the Record, because it required me to go back to sources that, in many instances that we'll find out through the presentation today, no longer exist because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has deleted, retired, retired is usually the word they use, but essentially they delete a lot of their history, or they edit a lot of their history. So there were some things that were on the record that were really difficult to navigate and find. So I spent lots of time in old libraries, in searching books, going through old journals. Fortunately, we have great things like the Joseph Smith Project that was now bringing out things like the Times and Seasons and the WASP to get some things that were happening in the Nauvoo era. And then we also have the Wayback Machine, which is a godsend, that we're able to go back and find some of these internet archives that kept a lot of this information. So that's a little bit of a preview of what On the Record is about. I will give you this QR code ahead of time, but this is the QR code that you can scan with your phone camera, and you can download a copy of On the Record. It is an interactive PDF, like I said. You can scroll through it on your phone. Computer is great too, because from your computer you would be able to click on the source links. Unfortunately, on tablets, I found that when you click on the source link and want to explore something further in On the Record, it will move you into a new screen and then moves you back to the original spot in the PDF. But you can take a picture of that and download it. It's always available at lattergaystories.com or org/record. And the cool part is now we're almost approaching 30,000 downloads of On the Record. So if you just type in On the Record LDS in Google, it's the first thing that pops up. The even cooler part about that is the church has a number of talks called On the Record, and we rank higher than the church's talks. So the first thing you're going to get if you type in On the Record in Google, On the Record LDS, On the Record LGBTQ, On the Record Mormon, it will be On the Record, and you can download it from there. Just a brief get to know me. Again, as was introduced, my name is Kyle Ashworth. This is a picture of my little family. We just took this last week at Flaming Gorge. My partner Jay and I live in Heber City, and our 4 kids. I was previously married. My son Kason on the left, or the right, and then my twin girls up front, and my daughter in front of me, Kaylee. So that's our cute little family. And I am the host of the Latter Gay Stories podcast, which, if you follow some of the podcast history, the Latter Gay Stories podcast was originally the Gay Mormon Stories podcast that John DeLynn started with the Open Stories Foundation. I took it over almost 4 years ago after Daniel Parkinson kind of gave up the reins and let the podcast shelf. It was a lifeline to me, and as I was coming out and navigating this world, I thought that resource needed to be out there for queer Mormons and those outside of Mormonism. And so I rebranded after Nelson said that saying Mormon was a win for Satan. So it was the Latter Gay Stories, which I thought was even punnier. This is the opening page to the opening page to On the Record. I started with this because I think it begins a premise as to the discussion that we're going to have today. And as I mentioned earlier, this will be a fire hose experience. Just take in as much as you can. But really, I want you to fall down the rabbit hole of On the Record. There are so many different ways for you to explore this topic. But I want to go through first the descriptors: diabolical, blasphemy, pervert, unnatural, abnormal, an affliction, impure, victim, under the control of Lucifer, weak, transgressor, evil, ridiculous, sinful, ugly, predator, sin of the ages, deceitful, abominable, detestable, crime against nature, addict, unmanly, promiscuous, enslaved, contaminant, carnal, selfish, aggressive, brutal, abusive, violent, hopeless, corrupt, filthy, dreadful, unhappy, counterfeit, and a host of other descriptors that were used and still to this day are being used against the LGBTQ community. This is the bridge that we start on. When we talk about building bigger and stronger bridges between the LDS and LGBTQ community, this is the side of the bridge that the LGBTQ community is asked to build their bridge to. These statements, these descriptors that are used against the community. So I wanted to use that in the very beginning of On the Record to kind of set a tone. Interestingly enough, in the Nauvoo era, Joseph Smith, and I want to also say by no means am I a Mormon historian. I've dabbled in enough. That's why I always start these presentations with the philosophy of men mingled with Scripture. So I'm both protected by temple, right, and covenant, but also that's my own precursor to these presentations. I just really love this stuff. I really love the fascinating history behind this, but more importantly, I want us to become better. I want Latter-day Saints who are sitting in pews, and I want gay Latter-day Saints who are still sitting in pews wanting to build these bigger and stronger bridges to better understand where the church is at and why traditionally we're still in these spaces. I think it's really important that once we understand where we've been, from there we can decide where we're going to go and how we're going to move forward. So in the very beginning, one of the first quotes that I found concerning this topic was Joseph Smith. He spoke about Sodom and Gomorrah, and Sodom and Gomorrah is one of these great stories that is also, we usually call them these scriptures that are used to kind of bludgeon the LGBTQ community. Kind of the Leviticus, the Deuteronomies, the remember the Sodom and Gomorrahs where Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed for its wickedness, sexual provision, the sexual wickednesses. Joseph Smith said something completely different. Joseph Smith taught that Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't destroyed because of the sexual experiences of its people, but it was destroyed because they didn't listen to the prophets and they were terrible housekeepers and invitees of people. So that was the core reason. And I think this is important because we jump into this history, this changing history of where the church taught that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed, the people were destroyed for not listening to the prophets, into this space where Sodom and Gomorrah now becomes the destruction of the cities happened because of homosexuality. We're going to see this happen and see where it kind of cues in Mormon history. One of the first stories of Mormon history that I found that dealt with buggery, as it was called in Nauvoo, was with John C. Bennett. And for many Mormon historians, John C. Bennett is a familiar name. He was the mayor of Nauvoo and also the mayor general of the Nauvoo Legion. This is an interesting story, and again, thanks to the recently produced Joseph Smith papers, we're starting to understand more of John Bennett's story. And interestingly enough, I love the John Bennett story because this is friend and foe. John Bennett was friends of Joseph Smith and then foe of Joseph Smith, and friends of Joseph Smith and foe. And the history in the church with John Bennett and Joseph Smith was really interesting. But one of the first alleged accounts of sodomy within the Nauvoo era was with John C. Bennett and a guy named Francis Higbee. They were both excommunicated at the same time. They were excommunicated for a crime that need not be named. A lot of history that jumps into this, and I'm not going to go into a lot of personal history about John Bennett, but I want you to, and I think this is a good opportunity when you jump into On the Record to start studying that. And I'm only offering this on the first couple slides so you can kind of see. In the On the Record, there is the Times and Season and the WASP that are sourced, so you can start going through some of these and reading some of these accounts. I am not fully convinced that John C. Bennett was gay. I'm more convinced that John C. Bennett would be what we typically would call today bisexual, or having experiences with both men and women. Interestingly enough, in this exchange, John C. Bennett also accused Joseph Smith of being bisexual and having some of these experiences as well. This began a feud between John Bennett and Joseph Smith, which really was played out similar to what we see today in the newspapers, in the WASP and in the Times and Seasons. And again, you can read those inside On the Record and start navigating that world. But one of the interesting parts about that story as well is we get into Orson Pratt, who was also involved between the John Bennett and Joseph Smith saga. And just a few days after Orson Pratt was involved in that, he was also excommunicated from the church. So Joseph did a lot of interesting things in that time in terms of this topic. But moving into the Utah era, I want to first start with Brigham Young. We're talking in 1851. This is the Utah Territory, and the church and the government starts into the first laws that we see on the books regarding sexuality. And they implement in 1981 the sodomy laws. The sodomy laws in the Utah Territory were really vague and super unclear. So in 1852, the Utah Territory did away with the sodomy laws, essentially making sodomy legal in the Utah Territory. But it wasn't that it was legal and no one could enforce it. It was that Brigham Young decided to take enforcement upon himself and allow church leaders and the church itself to enforce sodomy laws within the Utah Territory. So 1851, the law was introduced. 1852, it was essentially taken out when they took the law away. They just didn't replace it with anything. And by 1853, the church was enforcing it on its own. There are 3 written stories that are accounted for On the Record about three specific experiences where Brigham Young, who was aware of instances of people who had these tendencies that were castrated. The first one happened... The 2 of them actually were performed by the same bishop, Bishop Snow. After the first one, Brigham Young was notified and said Bishop Snow is castrating people for sodomy. Brigham Young's response was, I think Bishop Snow is capable of deciding what's important for Bishop Snow, and I think he's trying to do his very best. The 3 accounts are written On the Record. You can explore each of those stories. Super fascinating and semi-terrifying. The first known account that we have in the Brigham era of transgenderism it happens with a man named Almarin Grow. Now, Almarin Grow was, for all intents and purposes, a very active Latter-day Saint in the Salt Lake Valley, but he started wearing his wife's clothing. So this could either be one of our first experiences of cross-dressing, or which I think probably is extending into transgenderism, where someone is identifying not as the father or the male in the household anymore. Almarin Grow, this is written by Warren Musser. Warren Musser was a church historian at the time. Almarin Grow has given me his daughter, now 12 years old, to raise. He's appointed me as her guardian because President Young told him to go south and never return. This seemed to be the method that the church used in order to get rid of people who didn't fit the mold. And because Almarin Grow was now wearing his wife's clothing and refused to stop, Brigham exiled him from Salt Lake City and sent him away. I believe there were 3 daughters. Millen Musser took one of those daughters. 2 of the other daughters were adopted into other families as well. Interestingly enough, just a little tidbit, Almarin did lose custody of all of his children. He was sent south. He ended up relocating to California. He made multiple petitions back to Brigham Young to return to Salt Lake City, but that was never granted. He did die in 91 years of age in California and never returned back to Salt Lake City. That was kind of a baseline on how the church treated transgenderism in that era. I also want to just say, I'm not going to go through a lot of personal histories. There's just a couple of these we're going to go through just because in this era there wasn't a lot of doctrine and a lot of policies that were written concerning this topic, but more just stories of individual people and their experiences. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of these. The next one is a little bit more Mormon famous. Joseph F. Smith, who was the second counselor to John Taylor. Joseph F. Smith, as you'll remember, was a missionary to the Sandwich Islands, which is now known as Hawaii today. He sat down with John Taylor's son, Bruce, because there were rumors that Bruce was gay. In those days, and we'll talk about this all the way up until about the 70s, the church, if you had these tendencies, the church would get you in contact with a church leader, usually an apostle or a member of the First Presidency, and they would create a plan for you. And this is what happened with John Taylor's son, President Taylor's son, Bruce. He did sit down with Joseph F. Smith. Joseph F. Smith interviewed him, discussed it, and in his diary wrote, "I had a long discussion last evening with Bruce Taylor, and he is Aikani." Now, for those of you who understand Hawaiian, Aikani is? A male lover. There's a lot of information on the record about two types of people that were talked about in Hawaiian culture, Aikani and Mahu. Mahu is the third gender, is a transgender type person. They are not male, they're not female, but in Hawaiian language or tradition, they are in the middle. And so these two people existed within this culture. As Joseph F. Smith met with Bruce Taylor, he immediately wrote in his journal, he's Aikani, he's gay. As a result of that meeting, Bruce Taylor was, as you guessed it, asked to leave Salt Lake City. He was packed up and shipped. He left Salt Lake City, subsequently left the church. He relocated to Oregon, where he died a bachelor at 80 years old, and never married. The cross-dressing didn't really escape the Young family. And this is a fun story about Madame Patarini, also known as Brigham Morris Young. Brigham Morris Young was Brigham Young's 35th son and had an amazing falsetto. No indication, no history, I threw this in just for fun, that Brigham Morris Young was gay. It was just that he enjoyed kind of the vaudeville, the dress-up, drag style performance of the era. And so Madame Patarini, if you drink, there is Ogden Distillery has a gin called Madame Patarini, modeled after Brigham Morris Young. He did sing at the Tabernacle at Temple Square, which is something I don't think we're going to be able to get past today. But it is something that happened in his day. Morris was also one of the original founders of the Young Men's MIA, the Mutual Improvement Association, and the current predecessor. That program was the current predecessor of the Young Men's program. So if we all had young men's leaders like that, we would have come out much earlier in life. Another fun story is Louis Felt and May Anderson. This was a super great one you can jump into in On the Record because they were known and publicly written as the David and Jonathan of the primary. These two women lived together. They shared the same bed together. They shared the same home together. Louis Felt was a sister wife in a polygamous marriage. May Anderson was not part of that polygamous marriage, but Louis and May fell in love. And they ended up, after another sister wife of Louis Felt passed away, May and Louis raised those children together in a home in Salt Lake City. They also were the founders of the primary program and a little magazine you may know of called The Children's Friend. These two creators were the voice and face of the primary program up into May Anderson's death in the 1920s. Super fascinating story. The children of May and Louis, in their journals, record how they lived in a big house together and in the same bedroom and in the same bed, but the church still will not admit that they had any relationship other than they were friends. We'll keep it at that, I suppose. One of the turning points in Mormon history came when Oscar Wilde visited Salt Lake City. Oscar Wilde was from across the pond, from the United Kingdom, and he was forming what they call the aesthetic revolution. And he was out visiting places throughout the United States on tour to try to better understand exactly, to better promote artistic culture. He really offended a lot of church leaders, John Taylor being one of them. When he visited John Taylor's home, which was one of Brigham Young's wives' homes just across the street from Temple Square, he thought the home was ugly, and he let John Taylor know that it was ugly. John Taylor wouldn't be bested by the home, so decided to take him across the street to the Tabernacle to show what the pioneer spirit had been able to build, and Wilde called the Tabernacle a soup kettle. He said it was large enough to hold 14 polygamous wives or families, and he said it was wife, 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 husband, wife, 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 wife. That was the seating arrangement he saw at the Tabernacle. He was also not, coming from this aesthetic era, he wasn't really impressed that the pine had been painted to look like granite and that the pine benches were made to look like oak. He thought that was all fabricated. But more importantly, the part that really upset a lot of church leaders was that Oscar Wilde was also gay and had been on trial. The Irish government was after him and eventually got him convicted of homosexuality, buggery at the time. But Oscar Wilde in Salt Lake also brought the gays out. In typical fashion, in an Oscar Wilde event, you would have the front rows, and there would be women who would wear these sunflower boutonnieres, I guess, on their lapels as they would attend some of his meetings. When he comes to Salt Lake City and gets out on stage, he doesn't see women in the front row, but he sees a bunch of men, and they have a sunflower boutonniere, and they're there to see and support who they thought was kind of a revolutionary leader, someone who spoke their language. That infuriated church leaders, especially George Buchanan, who makes a general conference talk about it and says, we need to stop these homosexuals. We don't use homosexuals not until, even though the word was originated in Germany in the 1890s, there were a number of descriptors used, but George Buchanan uses the General Conference pulpit of 1879 and 97 to say, we've got to control the gays among Zion. And the easiest way for us to do that is by having faith. And so he instills his apostolic promise that God will destroy the gays if the Latter-day Saints are faithful. I'm still here. So I'm not quite sure the Latter-day Saints were faithful, or George Buchanan was speaking the mind and will of God. We're going to fast forward in history a little bit, but I do want to say that there are still a number of stories that are super fascinating and on the record in this era. One is Eva McCleary, Edith Chapman, and Joseph Fielding Smith, all unique stories. Eva was a transgender woman who was born William McCleary, who was a bootmaker in Salt Lake City. Super fascinating story where originally as a young boy learned the art of bootmaking in England, moved to Salt Lake City, married a woman, had children, and then started transitioning, cross-dressing first, and then transitioning into Eva McCleary as a woman. She at this point ran a very successful bootmaking cobbler business in Salt Lake and had quite the clientele. The Salt Lake Tribune started putting pieces together and said, but wait, you were divorced and a wife and children. But so Eva puts into the newspaper that she always was a woman, but she was dressing as a man this whole time to kind of throw the scent. And the Salt Lake Tribune bit off on that. But then more people started investigating the story and confronted. And so there was a second Salt Lake Tribune article that was posted, essentially a tell-all. And Eva explained the whole story of how she'd always felt like a woman. And that was exactly as she had presented, exactly as she had always felt. And that if you didn't want to use her services, find someone else to build your boots. That didn't happen because people loved the way Eva would build boots. And so she remained in her boot shop in Salt Lake City until her death. Unfortunately I'm giving the whole story away, but unfortunately for her lasting legacy, as her family buried her, they buried her William McCleary in the Salt Lake City cemetery, acknowledging that she was born a twin. Her twin passed away, and they said that the reason why she wanted, or he, according to the family, wanted this alter ego was to relive the life of the twin daughter, sister that had passed away. And that was the family's justification for that. Edith Chapman, fascinating story. If you ever visit Liberty Park, look across the street, and you will find Edith Chapman's home. It was also known as Salt Lake's first lesbian brothel. Edith is a fascinating story in Mormon history. She also was the daughter of a polygamous family. Super, super fun story with Edith Chapman. And Joseph Fielding Smith. You may remember Joseph Fielding Smith. He was a grandson of Hiram Smith. And in Mormon history, you'll know that at those days, the patriarch of the church was a passed down through a family experience before we had stake patriarchs. Joseph Fielding Smith was the last patriarch to the church before they created stake patriarchs. Joseph Fielding Smith was also rumored to have been gay because there were multiple men that had sexual relationships with Joseph Fielding Smith as a general authority, as the church patriarch. Most of those relationships originated with young men from the University of Utah. After the first presidency found out this was happening, he was released from his calling due to ill health. And guess what? he was sent to Hawaii, where he lived the rest of his days. It wasn't until President David O. McKay received a letter from Joseph Fielding Smith's wife asking for his membership to be reinstated. Although we have no record that it was actually taken away, they wanted to call Joseph Fielding Smith into the Stake High Council, and it was required that the first presidency gave approval. David O. McKay at the time received the letter from his wife and authorized that he could, because he had been changed and fixed, he could resume service in the church, and he did become a Stake High Counselor. Joseph Fielding Smith, super interesting story. I do know that his family still argues that he was not homosexual, that all of the stories about that were made up. However, the partners that he existed or had relationships with negate that. Interesting part of Mormon history. Moving forward to Joseph Fielding Smith, this is an interesting, I threw this in here because this historical part of this story talks about there being no gender identity in the hereafter. That this would completely negate what we're hearing today from church leaders that says that our gender is eternal and lasting, that if you were born a male, you will go to heaven as a male. Joseph Fielding Smith begs to differ. He says that only gender exists in the celestial kingdom. In the terrestrial and telestial kingdoms, genders will be removed from you. The powers of procreation will be removed as well, and I take it that men and women in these kingdoms will be exactly what the Christian world expects us to be, neither man nor woman, merely immortal beings having received the resurrection. Not sure exactly how Oakes is going to deal with this one. Correct. The church is starting to have a homosexual problem. So, LeGrand Richards, in 1945, devises a plan. We clearly haven't been able to be as faithful as George Buchanan thought we could be, to have God destroy the homosexuals from Zion. So we need to start figuring out who among us is a homosexual. So LeGrand Richards begins a secret surveillance program, and he enlists a number of fellow programmers, David O. McKay, J. Reuben Clark, Marky Peterson, and Charles Olson, who is the chief of police of Salt Lake City. And they form an investigative task. They even open up a small shop on Main Street in Salt Lake City, unmarked on the door, but that was the central office to this investigative surveillance committee that they were forming. Their first line of defense was to go to bishops and stake presidents. When you or I would go to our bishop or stake president and confess that we had these feelings or attractions, your stake president or bishop was advised to let these men know, this committee know, that there was someone who experienced these thoughts or feelings or had involved themselves in these actions, and that they would be dealt with from there. There was a number of these experiences these surveillance programs that took place. If you're familiar with Salt Lake City, the food court, clearly when I talk about malls, I start with the food court. So if you know the food court at Salt Lake City on State Street, where it opens up into State Street, across the street from there is the Belvedere Hotel. The Belvedere was originally owned by the church and rumored to have a number of homosexuals live there. Some of my gay friends live there, which I think is apropos. That was originally owned by the church, and also the Hotel Utah, the Joseph Smith Memorial Building, was owned by the church. There were apartment buildings in that building as well. The church did surveil both of those buildings in order to try to root out homosexuals in that area. And currently where the conference center at Temple Square sits was the Deseret Gym, and the steam room among the gays is very well known as a cruising spot, and the church also knew that as well, so they set up secret surveillance there. Just to give you a little bit of background as what was happening in American history, we do in the 1950s. The surveillance program wasn't all far-fetched when you think about what was happening in American politics. We're talking about the Lavender Scare, the Red Scare, the Second Red Scare, McCarthyism, where essentially the government had deemed gays and lesbians viable threats to American society, especially within communism. They felt that gays would be susceptible or manipulated, and so it was important for War, especially in 47 at the beginning of the Cold War, to kind of root out and isolate these homosexuals. Senator McCarthy, who made these unfounded accusations against gay people, created the Second Red Scare, and the 1950s brought in this era of investigating homosexual men and lesbian women for the purposes of deciding whether or not they were guilty of treason. Also, at the same time, World War II and the ending of World War II was bringing out more gays and lesbians, essentially because of many people have speculated as to why, but men were stationed with men for such a long period of time, but also moved back into an unfettered society where they had a little bit more free reign in their personal life as they were beginning to build their lives. And so as gay men and women came out of the war and began to assimilate into communities, and especially into this new thing that we call suburbs in American society, we started to see more and more people come out. So the church obviously had a wicked defense. Jumping right back into it in 1952, J. Reuben Clark says, this is the first time, and I wanted to note this, that the church uses the word homosexuality. He uses it twice. Once, saying Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed for homosexuality, and second, he calls it a filthy crime. He did speak this at the General Conference, the Relief Society meeting at General Conference, and he also admonished men to be more manly and women to be more womanly. That would prevent homosexuality. 1958, this nice fellow, seems to be a generous and decent man, enters the Mormon church into the sex business, where we start focusing on the sexual lives of Mormons, and this really began with Mormon doctrine. He also starts reiterating teachings that he heard from George Q. Cannon, was that parents would rather, it'd be better that you come back in a pine box dead with your virtue than you being at home alive with it, or without your virtue. This was kind of the beginning of the really clamping down on sexual sin within the church. But there were many players in this game. Ernest Wilkinson, who was the president of BYU. Now, we talked about our secret surveillance societies that was still existing and happening. There was a second group that was formulated. Ernest Wilkinson, Spencer Kimball, Marky Peterson, and Dallin H. Oaks each had their own role. Kimball would be the point man with members who were gay. And I told you earlier, if a bishop or a stake president knew someone in their ward was gay, they would refer them to that secret group or this surveillance group at a church office building. One of the first people that they would meet usually was Spencer Kimball. And Spencer Kimball gave these men, typically, a list of 18 items, a checklist of 18 items. If they went through each of these items, they would effectively change their sexual orientation. I did hear recently on Richard Ostler's podcast a man named Warren Bittner. It's probably maybe 10, 15 episodes previous. He described meeting with President Kimball and receiving this checklist. It's a fascinating and interesting discussion. So we have Ernest Wilkinson, president of BYU, Spencer Kimball there. Marky Peterson would continue that church surveillance program under the direction of LeGrand Richards. And so he was kind of the church's point man in this, I don't want to call it trifecta, but that was his role. Dallin Oaks, at this point, was on the church board of education. He was acting as a liaison between periodicals and messaging that could be created through seminary institutes and the church boards of education. He could disseminate that through to BYU, but also he was acting as an assistant into the 12, so he had the ear of the first presidency at the same time. So he really had manipulated himself into a interesting spot. He also had a legal background, so he could work laws and legislation that would benefit the church's position in how they were treating
There are certain
gays.
crimes and offensive conduct which will this year bring immediate suspension from this university. In general, these are offenses involving moral turpitude, such as adultery or fornication or other breaches of the Mormon moral code. Nor do we intend to admit to our campus any homosexuals. If any of you have this tendency and have not completely abandoned it, may I suggest that you leave the campus immediately after this assembly, and if you'll be honest enough to let us know the reason, we will refund your tuition. We do not want others on this campus to be contaminated by your presence.
That was not spoken at a family home evening. That was the president of BYU who was speaking to the membership on campus who said, you, if you are gay, are not welcome on this campus. At this point, I also want to point out that the church didn't make a distinction between homosexual acts and the homosexual. If you were just gay, you were guilty of these crimes that we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. There wasn't a distinction as to whether or not you were just acting on your homosexuality. It was just that you were gay. And that was one of the precursors to attendance at BYU. Anyone here remember that? Yeah. And you... We do not want to admit anyone, not only because we don't want homosexuals on our campus, but did you catch the part? We don't want them to be contaminated by your presence, as if we could just brush it off. So this leads our discussion into a whole new era at BYU. And if we go back and remember that group of people, Ernest Wilkinson, Spencer W. Kimball, Dallin Oaks, and Mark E. Peterson. They have formed a separate subcommittee that begins what we know as a reparative therapy program at BYU. If we can't essentially use the gospel and our written word to convince people that they shouldn't be gay, then there must be clinical reasons or clinical methodologies or practices that will ungay them. And that's really the direction that BYU starts to go into. And they start a shock therapy, aversion therapy programs. They used a number of different treatments. Vomit therapy and odor therapy, visual stimuli, and electrical shock therapy. And we're going to talk about all of these, and I will give you a precursor that this is difficult. That some of this stuff is really, really, really difficult. I want to give you a little bit of a timeline. The 1959s to 1970 era, these on-campus therapies were started in certain spaces. There wasn't an actual clinical location until the 1970s, when the basement of, ironically, the Smith Family Living Center was converted into the area that the electrical shock therapies were administered. From 1971 to 1980, Dallin H. Oaks replaces Ernest Wilkinson as president of BYU. And he has Gerald Zai take over a new program called the University Standards Office. That University Standards Office was eventually renamed in 1991 as the Honor Code Office. In 1947, a similar group had already began at BYU, a standards office or a standards group, but it essentially was to reaffirm the message of the church. What Dallin H. Oaks did with the program was converted it into a more investigative program to start rooting out the homosexuals on campus. And that was the purpose of the University Standards Office. As a podcaster, I have some really fascinating discussions on the podcast. I would just say Judith Mayer, we'll talk about Judith if you're not familiar with her. She was the artist who painted most of the gospel library art that you remember from Mormonism. She also painted the really big family history mural. It's at the Family History Center, the one that's like 13 feet long. She was a closeted lesbian the whole time and living with a partner while she was commissioned by the church painting these. As an RA at BYU in the 1970s, she was hired by the Honor Code Office to spy on other women for the purposes of determining if any of the women in her building were lesbians. She was paid to do that. There were a number of these programs that existed under Dallin Oaks' program. In 1983, BYU began the process of phasing out the reparative therapy programs, which was kind of a blessing. But again, remember David O. McKay, J. Reuben Clark, Mark E. Peterson, the chief of police of Salt Lake City, Spencer Kimball. These guys were all running kind of a clandestine underground operation to still continue to find gay men and women. Warren Bittner, the gentleman that Richard Osler interviewed, also talks about the secret spying program and what was happening at BYU at the time. In 1967, As this program was being launched, 72 students were expelled under the pretenses of homosexual activity, suspected, they say. Security files were also created for each of these people, and as you were given your tenure, as throughout your tenure at BYU, you were watched and monitored. One little part that I wanted, even though we're jumping ahead here, I wanted to talk about the Max McBride dissertation. This was really monumental for a number of reasons. Max McBride was a graduate student at BYU who also was the chief student that was administering and using the shock therapy program. There were 17 men who were entered into Max McBride's program. 14 of them made it through what he would determine successfully. That's just that they made it through the program. Nobody's sexual orientation had ever changed, nor did the church claim that they claimed that it could be changed, but the church has provided no evidence showing that anybody's sexual orientation did change. Fair Mormon apologists say that the treatments were never sexual in nature, that there was never, and we'll discuss, I just got a little 5-minute video here from someone who was involved in the therapies. The church, through Fair Mormon, is arguing that there was never any pornography used, that these people were here. Interestingly enough, this was, I have up here the participation form. If you were involved in the therapies, and I want to also point out that you were not involved by choice. You were found out, then you were shipped into an office, and you were given 2 options. 1, you will leave the campus. We will call your family and let them know that you're gay and you're a deviant and you're filthy and you're disgusting. Or we avoid calling your family and you enter into the reparative therapy program. According to Fair Mormon, this was a voluntary program that people signed up on their own by their own choice. According to Max McBride, the use of adverse electric shock would be used in the program. The showing of 35-millimeter slides that might be construed as suggestive in nature could be used. According to the church, there was never any pornography, that they used just basic photos from regular magazines as part of this conversion therapy or aversion therapy program. It was also important to the church that in Max McBride's dissertation, Brigham Young University was not in any way directly responsible for or endorsing these tactics. Currently, Max McBride does hold an active license. He practices in Provo and is still not practicing shock therapy, to my knowledge, but Max McBride still exists. 5-minute video. I just wanted you to kind of get a bird's eye view of what this experience was like.
I was in my junior year at BYU, and of course you want to do, it was almost like being like an apprentice or learning how to treat patients. And one of the things that we could do, we could volunteer for, was to do the electroshock therapy for people who wanted to change their sexual orientation. And at the time, of course, I knew that I was gay. I had experiences and everything, and I had no desire myself to change my orientation. However, I thought it was really interesting that there were people who did. And I was very closeted at the time, even though I did have a lover at the time. I was really closeted. And so we did the therapy, as we referred to it, then in the basement of the Smith Family Living Center on the BYU campus. A lot of times, like, BYU security would catch people like in compromising positions or whatever, and they had the choice of either being kicked out of school and their families called and informed about what they had done, or they could undergo this therapy. And so we had quite a few people who were going through it. And then there were other people who felt like so much guilt over their sexuality, or had been promised that if they underwent this therapy, that they'd be able to marry and have children, and they would just be turned away. Of course, they had to have the desire to change. Therefore, if the therapy failed, then it was always their fault because they didn't have enough desire to change. But anyway, they would come in, usually 3 times a week. I would be behind a glassed one-way mirror, quite a large mirror. I'd be sitting behind there, and they would be on the other side of that, and they had the choice. They could look at pornographic magazines, or we would show videos up on the wall, and we would tape electrodes to their groin, and about 3 or 4 inches down from that on their thigh. Then we would also tape up on their chest. And we taped somewhere else too. I think it was up close to the armpits. And then we had another machine that would monitor their breathing and their heart rate. And what we would do is we would let them look at this stuff, and and if they were looking at homosexual pornographic material, we would wait until we could tell a difference in their heart rate. We had a dial that we turned, and that would determine the amount of current that would go into the shock. And if they were a new patient, then the current would be very low. And we would wait until we saw that they were getting aroused, and then we would push a button, and the voltage would go into the wire. And from the reaction that I saw them, and also the muscle spasms that went on, I'm sure that it was painful. And then after we did that, then we would the movies would automatically switch over, and we would show a man and a woman having sex, and we would play very soothing music in the background to try and get the mind to relate to that. When we got into the higher voltage with the people who had been doing it longer, you could see burn marks on the skin, and quite often they would also throw up during the therapy. I mean, this is just speculation, but most of the students there at BYU had never seen any pornography. After undergoing that kind of pain over a period of a couple of months, anybody would admit that they had completely changed. What they did was they kept records for as long as the people were at BYU. And then after they left BYU, there was no records kept to see what kind of success rate they had. And so and the statistics from just the BYU, I mean, these people were lying. They were desperate to get their degree and to get out of that situation. They had been blackmailed into that situation in the first place. We did have some people who became completely asexual after undergoing the therapy. But no, we never changed anyone from gay to straight.
This is the way it must happen. This is the way it will happen.
I do invite you to read Fair Mormon's response to aversion therapy at BYU. And then, when you're studying the On the Record, that's just a part of about a 45-minute video with multiple accounts from people who experienced aversion therapy and what was happening at BYU. I got a big section in On the Record on aversion and conversion therapy because the church really doubled down on some type of therapies to start convincing people that they could be changed. So we're in the 60s, 1969, the publishing of one of my most favorite books. If any of you follow the Latter Gay Stories podcast, you know that I have often talked about The Miracle of Forgiveness, the book that I find to neither be miraculous or forgiving. Given the time period, I think it's also appropriate to kind of understand what's happening in the nation at the same time, 1969. June 28th of 1969 was Stonewall, and the Stonewall riots that were happening in New York, which really was the cause of more public acceptance and attention to the LGBTQ community. So the church was grappling not only, it was probably one of the very first times I've seen the church rapidly respond to a public social issue. And that was with Spencer W. Kimball's book that also was published in 1969, The Miracle of Forgiveness. In the book, there's chapter 6 of The Miracle of Forgiveness, The Crime Against Nature, where Spencer Kimball talks about the queer community specifically. And a number of things that he had learned visiting with these gay members that were brought into his office at the church office building. And the first among them, this is in the very first paragraph of chapter 6, that masturbation leads to homosexuality. This was a lesson that apparently Kimball had learned. Also, I'm clearly not by experience, only through anecdotal and experiences of other people. I do have a number of Mormon historians who argue for the idea that Spencer Kimball himself had some internalized homophobia. That's a different podcast. He also says the existence of homosexuals is a crime against nature. Homosexuality also will lead to bestiality or sex with animals. It is the sin next to murder, and that gays are wrong in the sight of God. Oh, how did that get in there? With the podcast, we do have a little program we call Trash the Stash, which our listeners to date have trashed 2,216 copies of The Miracle of Forgiveness. A number of our viewers all over the country visit their Savers, DI, if we cut this part out of the recording, their church libraries, grandma's bookshelf, looking for copies of The Miracle of Forgiveness. All legal, I will say, at least that's how I advertise it. And people are getting rid of the copies of The Miracle of Forgiveness. There's a number of reasons for that. Some people have book burnings, others are using The Miracle of Forgiveness in art projects. But most importantly, we're getting them off the shelves so that messages like this don't continue to permeate, especially young people's lives. Because I do know that bishops and stake presidents are still using the miracle of forgiveness as the standard for mitigating and helping people navigate their, in their words, same-sex attraction. But I am no fan of the miracle of forgiveness. I do believe that it is neither miraculous or forgiving. Additional teachings in the miracle of forgiveness: that curiosity can lead to homosexuality, that gays are tools of Satan, homosexuals are perverts, homosexuals and their allies are degenerate, homosexuals who can't change are cowards, as he calls them, and that trans people will answer to your maker. These are all messages that are taught throughout the miracle of forgiveness. That also kind of gives you an idea as to the messages that were being taught to those vulnerable queer members who are visiting Spencer Kimball in his office for so many decades. BYU decides that not only is their aversion therapy program seemed to be working, but now it was time to bring a psychological front in, and it was time to bring in the big guns. And they were searching. I didn't mention this earlier, but one of Ernest Wilkinson's duties as part of that committee was to start advertising Brigham Young University as a place for these progressive, conservative, I would suppose, psychologists and psychotherapists outside of Utah, to bring them into BYU and to allow them an opportunity, a seat or a chair at the school to practice their aversion or conversion therapy programs. A number of these men are very familiar to those of you who have been to BYU. Dr. Robert Card, Dr. Alan Bergen, Dr. Lindsay Curtis, and Victor L. Brown. There were some other names as well. Dr. Eugene Thorne, he assisted Max McBride. We talked about Max McBride a little earlier with his thesis. I don't think I mentioned that thesis is available On the Record as well. You can read that. He also, Dr. Eugene Thorne was involved in the shock and vomit therapies. And then Dr. Dean Bird, who was the Assistant Commissioner of the LDS Family Services Program. He was also an author of a new brand of conversion therapy at BYU. I want to just quickly go through a couple of these men and their roles. Dr. Robert Card, the BYU professor who was also a psychologist, he believed that when it comes to curing homosexuality, the only measure of success is that they get heterosexually married. He knew he can convert somebody when they decided that it was okay for them to get married to a woman. He also was nicknamed the Shock Father because he was involved so heavily with the shock therapy program and continued to deviate or create new ways of shocking people in order to cure them of their homosexuality. He was so obsessed, or his fetish in this space was so great, that he also holds a number of patents. Among them was the device that would attach to the penis that would measure growth, but also heartbeat, that would administer electrical currents directly through that device through the penis. He patented that and currently does hold the patent on that device. I also think it's apropos that he died on January 21st, 2020, which was also the very day that Utah banned conversion therapy for minors. But there is a God. Dr. Alan Bergen was another BYU professor and psychiatrist. He was brought in from back east. Immediately my brain said Cambridge, but I know that's not correct. I'll have to talk with Alan and remember that. But he was brought to BYU as really a great find. In fact, I think BYU was even surprised that Alan Bergen was willing to come and teach. He believed that homosexuality is curable. It leads to bizarre acts. He believed that homosexuality was caused by environmental issues and could be fixed with prayer. He also believed that gays should be excluded from society and that there was no rightful place in society for a homosexual. Dr. Alan Bergen is still alive today. We're going to talk about him a little bit further in the On the Record. He has a number, probably 8 or so places within On the Record where his influence has been felt. He also wrote prolifically in the Ensign and New Era. Dr. Lindsay Curtis was a medical doctor and also a consultant to the Quorum of the 12. Dr. Curtis was also the founder of the Ogden Women's Clinic. He was a physician. The church used him kind of as the public physician who wasn't directly tied into the church to also promote this. He was also an author with a number of books. He believed gays and lesbians are not happy people, that their relationships are unnatural. He believed that homosexuals convert other gays, so it was a contact sport. So if you brushed against one in a hallway, you could be contaminated by that. He also believed that gays are not compatible or capable of having meaningful families or relationships. Like I said, he did consult frequently with the Quorum of the 12. Specifically, his point person was Spencer W. Kimball. Victor L. Brown was the presiding bishop in the presiding bishopric. He believed pornography caused homosexuality. He used the conference center pulpit to share his views prolifically. He also believed that gays were the cause of the moral decay, that gay exposure contaminated children, and that only manly or true men should hold the priesthood. Who could forget Boyd K. Packer? This was a 1976 talk. Some of you may remember that. Was where he came out with a number of fun experiences like the little factory. Boyd K. Packer believed that masturbation was the cause of many problems, homosexuality being one of them, and he likened it to the little factory speech, where he told young boys not to start the little factory, because if you did, you would eventually lead to some of these acts like other boys had and eventually become gay. Within that talk, he also told a story about him visiting as a general authority, as an apostle, a mission where a mission companion said that confessed to Elder Packer that he had beat up his companion who had admitted to him that he was gay. In that conference talk, President Packer thought that was a brilliant idea and said, I would rather have the companion do it than me, because it wouldn't look as great for a general authority to beat up a gay person, but I'm glad you did it. In that talk, he also convinced the young men that anything homosexual is of the devil. The church has completely deleted that talk from, you can't find it on the church website at all. It is completely gone, which is good, but it is on the record, and it exists there, thanks again to some of the things that existed. That talk eventually made it into another periodical called To the One, and some of you may remember To the One, where he then begins to talk about conversion therapy programs. He says, I accept that the word homosexual is an adjective and a temporary condition, but I reject that it being used as a noun or a permanent one to describe a person. He says some who become tangled in this disorder become predators, and they proselyte the young or the inexperienced. And this was kind of the footing that Boyd K. Packer starts when it comes to this topic. If any of you know my Mormon story, I talk a lot about letter to a friend. And before I got here this morning, I actually opened my mission scriptures and pulled out my letter to a friend, and I was going to bring it, but I left it. Which seems so healing sometimes, just to leave it. Letter to a Friend was a pamphlet that was published and written by Spencer W. Kimball. I was a seminary president, and I went through the church's distribution catalog and found this. This was billed as one of these, essentially what I believe when we originally talked about the 18 things that Spencer Kimball would sit people down in his office who were accused of homosexuality or confessed that, I'm pretty certain a letter to a friend is what he was giving to these men, and very rarely women, who would come and meet with him. It just essentially goes through a whole list of things that you need to do in order to change your sexuality. I bought that as a 17-year-old. I carried it with me all through my mission. I read it frequently. In fact, I probably have Letter to a Friend completely memorized. I read it so often, and it still resides in my mission scriptures, mainly just to remember where I've been and where I've come. And that Letter to a Friend is part of my history, but it is not my foundation. In the 1980s, there were a number of talks that we talk about in On the Record, but the church finally started making some official periodicals that were distributed only to church leaders. In 1981, you may remember Hartman Rector's talk that has also now been almost completely deleted from the church's website. They kept some portions of it. It was a 23.5-minute talk. The church, if you watch it now on the church's website, it's 11 minutes. It's just amazing, and it's not even on triple or double speed. They have taken out a number of parts of that talk. Fortunately, if you watch it on the record, I have the church's version and I have the original version. And so you can continue to see what the original version talked about. One line in there: if children have a happy family experience, they will not want to be homosexual. So thank you, parents, for creating terrible experiences at home and made me a homosexual. And we'll talk about how even wrong that was. In 1981, this little brown book that you may be familiar with was created. It was called Homosexuality. It was released only to church leaders. There were a number of things inside homosexuality. I break it down inside of the On the Record that were given to help change sexuality. LDS Family Services helped draft and guide that. In 1983 and 89, the church handbooks were updated. In 1983, that change was that a church court could be held for someone who is guilty of homosexuality or lesbianism, as they called it. In 1989, the church made a change in that handbook, clarifying that homosexual relations, not just homosexuality itself, would require a church disciplinary council. And I think that's something you probably will miss reading through On the Record, but all the way up until 1989, just being homosexual, not acting upon it, just identifying as gay was reason for discipline. After the 1989 handbook change, they said homosexual acts, not just being a homosexual. Other key things you're going to find in the 1980 version in that timeline through On the Record is that these are just some key topics, some headlines to talks that were given that are all sourced in On the Record. Homosexuality, it's worse than abortion or adultery. Dating and marriage, a key to eliminating homosexual behavior. The cause of homosexuality, failure of parents in the home. Homosexual relationships are dead end. A priesthood holder would not be homosexual. Members who transition their gender will be excommunicated. And Mormon doctors, this was also in a handbook change, Mormon doctors who perform any operation that is adjacent to transitioning for a transgender member will also be excommunicated. So the church not only went after the member, but also went after a physician if they were also Mormon who were providing these. 1984 leads us back into Dallin H. Oaks, and at this point he is now in the apostleship. He drafts a confidential memo that I also have a copy of On the Record, and you can read through it. I think it's 17 pages. The memorandum was given to church leaders for two purposes. One, we're talking about the 1980s, so in American history, we have the AIDS epidemic happening. So Anita Bryant, did everybody remember Anita Bryant? Did you see what happened to Anita this weekend? Her granddaughter married a woman. Her granddaughter. Anita was a terrible mother, or a terrible grandmother, and now her granddaughter is a lesbian. So Anita Bryant was happening. Anita Bryant was voracious, was not a friend of the LGBTQ community and used her platform throughout America to argue against any type of assimilation into society or even fair treatment. So that's what's happening in the 1980s. The AIDS epidemic is all over the news. And Dallin H. Oaks is essentially tasks himself to inform the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 with a number of guidelines because they know the church would be they would be called to give some type of media exposure to the topic. You can read through it. Here are a few of the highlights. Homosexuality is a vile affliction and an abomination. It can be cured. Gays will portray themselves as victims, saying that the church has persecuted them, because clearly the church has been so nice. The church should argue for laws that discriminate against gays in the workforce, especially with jobs that surrounded children. One generation of gay marriages would depopulate a whole nation, and eventually gays will extinguish the people of the earth. We talked about this prior to the event starting today. This is where that quote comes from. Oakes has used this a number of times, but this is where it originated, that if there is gay marriage and we have one generation of gay marriage, it will depopulate the whole nation. That's what he wrote in a large section of this. And then if we have multiple generations, it will extinguish the people of the earth. I'm glad that Oakes is here to see that we're now entering our second generation of gay marriages. And especially Anita Bryant. I'm happy that she's able to see this. Number 6 there, allowing gays in society is, as Oakes calls it, national suicide. In the 1990s, we still have a presence, and we're going to talk deep about what's happening in the 1990s. But first, the For Strength of Youth pamphlet is issued, and it calls homosexuality an abomination. In 1991, the First Presidency drafts a letter specifically to gay members. A copy of that letter is on the record. That they can overcome their homosexuality with sincere repentance. It also calls for members to love and offer understanding for those that struggle with same-sex attraction. In my research, this is one of the very first times I see something favorable coming from the church in terms of treatment of the gay community, the queer community. In 1991. In 1994, the LDS Family Services labels homosexuals dysfunctional products of dysfunctional families, and the idea that a overbearing mother and a distant father is the root of homosexuality. And so the attack goes from no longer poor gay kid, but vicious parents. And because of your inability to parent your children well, your children are gay. In 1997, President Hinckley says gays must live celibate lives. Other than that, they're welcome in the church. In 1998, the handbook is updated to mission presidents, specifically saying that gay members are not allowed to serve missions. In 1995, we get this fair document called the Proclamation to the World, the Family. Many of you are familiar with that. Two things I want to point out, and I added them here. A lot of people in the queer community get really upset about the Family Proclamation because of the restrictions and the idea that it places on the nuclear family, basically essentially saying what a family should look like. I do like the one line in here. In these sacred responsibilities, fathers and mothers are obligated to help one another as equal partners. Disability, death, or other circumstances may necessitate individual adaptation. I just want you to remember the picture of me and my partner and our 4 kids. I think that is a circumstance that may necessitate individual adaptation. And our family is wildly happy and successful. I know you probably can't read this, but the Family Proclamation is brought up often when we talk about homosexuality because its birth happened because of what was happening in Hawaii with a case, Bear versus Lewin, which were 3 same-sex couples who applied for marriage licenses in the state of Hawaii, and those licenses were denied, and they filed a lawsuit. They lost their lawsuit in October of 1991. In October of 1992, the state Supreme Court listened to that appeal and overturned that ruling, that Bear versus Lewin ruling, and sent it back for a revisit in the courts in May of 1993. That happened in January of 1994. Hawaii's legislature begins debating what the definition of marriage should look like while this original case was pending. In 1995, the LDS Church jumps in. Again, we're back into the sex business, thanks Bruce R. McConkie. The LDS Church petitions to intervene in the Bear case. And so they say that they are harmed because their doctrine and the premise of the church, which, as you may or may not know, the Polynesian islands, Hawaii included, as many as 25% of the population of all of Polynesia were Mormons, were members of the church. So a large number of Latter-day Saints made up not only the legislature, but also people within government in Hawaii. So the church had incredible influence and thought that they could really steer this case. So in 1995, the LDS Church petitions to intervene in the case. Their intervention is denied, because the courts believe that the church cannot prove that it has a stake in the case. They say that there is no specific doctrine, no specific teaching that allows the church to show any harm or cause to be harmed by Hawaii issuing marriage certificates. So guess what happens in 1995, just 2 months later? We get the proclamation. And a lot of things happened on the side. Howard W. Hunter becomes president of the church at that time. 18 months later, he passes away. Or was it 9 months later? I think it was nine months later. In 1995, Gordon Hinckley becomes president of the church. And just a few months later is when he presents to the General Relief Society the proclamation to the world. They then use this new proclamation as evidence, as part of their friend of the court, the amicus brief in the Hawaii case, as their evidence to show that they would be harmed because it does go against the nuclear family, and this is something that the church has now adopted. That's how we get the proclamation, and that's why the proclamation is important to this topic. As we move into the 2000s, how am I doing on time? Hi. Oh boy. Okay, so we're just going to go really quickly. Gordon Hinckley goes through a number of interviews and talks about this. He's on Larry King Live. He says that we're not anti-gay, we love gay people, they just have a problem, and we're going to try to help them fix the problem. 2008, we get into California. California's Prop 8, super fascinating because the church completely dives into Proposition 8. Started out as Proposition 22, again talking about the issuance of same-sex marriage licenses. The church infuses millions and millions of dollars of their own money into Proposition 8. They also, if you want to read on the record, there are 3 separate instances where the church reaches out to its members, not only for financial assistance, but also to place yard signs and then also to participate in town hall or grassroots meetings. The way the church essentially has created this grassroots campaign was to reach out to stake presidents, reach out to area authorities, who then reached out to stake presidents, who then reached out to bishops, who then reached out to each of the congregations. It was the Zion's camp all over again, and the church just replicated it. We get to 2006, where church PR sits down, and they have a pre-planned, pre-sourced questionnaire with elders Wickman and Oakes concerning specifically this topic. This, interestingly enough, this interview, this 2006 interview is still on the church's website. Some of the nuggets we get from this talk is that the church does not counsel against conversion therapy. This is coming from Elder Wickman. They're both sitting together answering questions through church PR. Gay does not exist in the next life. In my opinion, this is one of the largest clarion calls to suicide within the LGBTQ community, because here are 2 general authorities who say, if you don't want to be gay, wait until the next life, it will be taken away from you. And they deep dive into this discussion. The church does not accept responsibility for the BYU reparative therapies or the deaths that were associated. Being gay is like having a handicap or disability, they discuss. Elder Oak says parents should not take their gay kids out into public or introduce them to their friends or family members. Do not invite your gay children to be lengthy house guests. Do not approve of any gay relationship or partnership. He also says the Lord's way of loving is to love the sinner and condemn the sin. This 2006 Wickman interview is deep. Finally, the sisters arrive in Zion and start advocating for the LGBTQ community. Sister Okazaki says a family with a gay child is not a failed family. It's a family member who needs special love and understanding, who has love and understanding to give back. I also want to note that Sister Okazaki was also, she met with her apostle representative prior to the 1995 meeting, where President Hinckley said, I'm going to give you a choice. Do we release the family proclamation in priesthood meeting or Relief Society? She says, am I being asked? And they say, we basically want your advice. And she said, I would love for you to have that released in the Relief Society meeting, general Relief Society meeting, after we have an opportunity to review it and make some comments, and that was denied. And President Hinckley still issued the family proclamation in General Relief Society meeting, but didn't have any input from the Relief Society or Women Voices. Inside On the Record are secret videos. You may have seen these floating around the internet. I have all 15 of them on the record. One in particular is this is a behind the scenes. These meetings happen typically on Wednesdays or Thursdays, where all the apostles and the quorum of the Q15 get together and they discuss pending social issues in the church. This one in particular that you can watch is fascinating because they do talk specifically about gays. One thing that I find incredibly fascinating is a little bit of a speech by Elder Ballard. They're talking about using certain words and phraseology when it comes to talking about homosexuality. And he specifically mentions there's a reason why the church uses the term same-sex attracted. If you've ever wondered why and why the church hammers same-sex attracted, in this meeting they talk about why. It's because of its negative connotation. The church openly admits in this video, or Elder Ballard does, the reason why they use the phrase same-sex attracted is it sounds more dirty or deviant to the members when they hear it. So that's the reason why certain terminology is important. That's on the record. Bruce Hafen, he talks about in an Evergreen conference, some of you will wake up surprised on resurrection morning to find that you have been changed, that being gay is only a condition of this life. You may wonder if that doctrine is too good to be true, but I tell you, Elder Dallin H. Oaks has said it, so it must be true. Hallelujah. Also in an Evergreen meeting, former presiding bishop of the church, Keith McMullen, says same-gender attraction is a mortal challenge. To call yourself gay is a miscasting of yourself. In 2010, Boyd K. Packer wants to double down on the family proclamation to the world, calling it doctrine and revelation, that it should be canonized. He also says that bullying gay people is always an option. His 2010 conference talk has been completely eliminated from the church's website. It is available on the record. In the 2000s, Oak also says children of gay parents are victims of abuse, that if you have a gay if your parents are gay, if you are children in a same-sex relationship, that is equatable to child abuse. Chad Callister says faith and atonement will change your sexuality, and Uchtdorf offers some love, saying God loves all of his children, specifically the gay ones. The church website for the very first time in 2012 says that homosexuality is not a choice. And in 2015, the LDS Family Services announced that they will end conversion therapy. I do always like to throw in a 5-star Pinocchio salute, and that goes to Elder James Mason, who says, from what I have witnessed in General Conference, the brethren have rarely missed an opportunity to tell gay people exactly what the church thinks of them. That's the truth. That, I say, he's absolutely correct. The church has always been very vocal about how they feel about gay people. But the last part, never have I ever heard a word or sentence uttered that expressed anything other than kindness toward individuals with same gender attraction. That too is also on the record. As I mentioned, in 2012, the church created a new website called mormonsandgays.org. Ironically enough, when the church got rid of the word Mormon, that website still stayed up. So apparently the church had a problem with Mormons, but not with gays, because they kept Mormon and gay. Quentin L. Cook, as an apostle, wrote on the Mormon and Gay website that as a church, no one should be more loving and compassionate, and that we should not be disrespectful or exclude people who are not like us. In Utah history and nationwide history, 2013, Derek Kitchen, State Senator Kitchen, sued the state of Utah and won his case on the 20th of December in 2013, allowing gay marriages to happen in Utah, of all places, as a precursor to other states throughout the United States, most conservative state. And in June of 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges made same-sex marriages legal throughout the country. 3 days after that ruling, the church was quick to put out a statement that leaders should not perform same-sex marriages, that church property cannot be used for any activities related to same-sex marriages. Elder Christofferson also went on the record speaking to the Salt Lake Tribune, saying that Mormons are okay to support same-sex marriages. This is often something that is overlooked by the general membership because They think if they advocate for or find favor with the LGBTQ community, they will be punished. The truth is, most bishops and stake presidents still want to punish you, but as an apostle, he says you are okay to have differing views. One of my favorite apostles in terms of favorability, not that I'm fully convinced that he is advocating for the movement, is Elder Ballard. He has said some favorable and decent things. Among them is that Latter-day Saints should extend a hand of fellowship to those that we disagree with. October 2015, LDS Family Services, the church says they're no longer supporting conversion therapy. Now LDS Family Services comes out and says they specifically are not going to administer any conversion therapy program. As was mentioned earlier, in the state law, it was that was against minors. I will say that there's a second form of conversion therapy that exists, and it's less talked about, but always happening. And that's when your son or daughter goes to meet with their bishop, and the bishop starts into a talk therapy program. And still, the Pray the Gay Away exists, where righteous church service, temple attendance, fulfilling callings is still offered as a remedy to help young people overcome their same-sex attraction. I still think that is one of the most difficult parts of conversion therapy that still exists. I wish we had lots of time to talk about November, but this is the policy of exclusion that the church came out with, excluding members from young people. Picture that my 4 children would not be able to get baptized in the church because their parents were married. In my research and plenty of discussions with Greg Prince, I find this ultimately fascinating. According to sourced records of people within who have the opportunity to see these numbers, Greg Prince says 60,000 members resigned their membership in the year November, December, January at the end of 2015 as a result of the November 2015 policy. He also brought up the Liberty Wells, stake president of the Liberty Wells stake, who said 432 people from his stake submitted their resignation letters. That was 10% of his stake's population as of the November 2015 policy. One of the side effects that come out of the November 2015 policy was an increase of suicides. 32 people committed suicide immediately following the November 2015 policy. 27 of them were men, 3 were female, 2 were transgender. 26 of those deaths happened here in Utah, 4 in Idaho, 1 in Arizona, and in the New England area. When asked about the suicides, Elder Oaks made a response. The church PR department came out with one. Typical answer: every soul is precious in the sight of God. We mourn with the families. Elder Oaks, he says that's a question. A reporter says, less than a year ago, right here in Washington, D.C., my friend killed himself. He was Mormon and gay, and you've gone on the record saying that the church does not give apologies. Does religious freedom absolve you from responsibility in the gay Mormon suicide crisis? Elder Oaks' response to that was, that is a question that will be answered on Judgment Day, and I will be held accountable to a higher authority to that. Unbelievable. One of the unprecedented moves the church made was to feature Becky McIntosh's family story. Their son Sean came out as gay. He ended up getting married. He also left the church. The church featured their story. It's garnered more than 2 million views. I'm thinking it's closer to 3 million views now, about a story of a family who embraced their gay son. It was a monumental move for the church to do that. That was followed up by Larry Lawrence of the 70s saying, your marriage is counterfeit. So we finally get the church adding something positive, and immediately counterfeit marriages. 2 minutes, I'm so sorry. Okay. Elder Ballard again in 2017 meets at BYU. This is a quote that I use frequently. He says, as Mormons, we're not doing good at listening to and understanding the experiences of the LGBTQ community. We need to do better. I think that's a hallmark message. In April of 2019, the November 2015 policy was reversed. God changed his mind. Revelation was undone, and it all went away. You were no longer an apostate. Your children could join the church again, and that we would not hold excommunications for gay members, except they're still doing it. If you listen to the latest few podcast episodes, I've featured people who were married, active, wanting to attend church, and they were excommunicated. So here's my opinion. I don't really infuse my opinion into on the record, but The church disassembled the November 2015 policy, and they chopped it up in little pieces, and they instituted it into the new handbook, and it's just there in different pieces. And I do have on one of the posts on Latter-day Stories each of those sections where each section of the November 2015 policy reappears in the handbook. Elder Holland is super frustrated because when it comes to the youth of the church, there's a thin line between friendship and condoning behavior. He's upset that our Gen Z church members have friends who are gay and that they seem apologetic and still friendly towards those gay members, and he believes that's a problem. The church finally obeys and says that conversion therapy should be kicked out, and Ted Callister shows up on the scene just a month ago, kicking off Pride with a Deseret News article, a church news article that says that Satan disguises this plan of attack with alluring labels such as pro-choice for abortion, love and compassion, and endorsement of same-sex marriages. He says these solutions are nothing less than ticking time bombs wrapped with glitter and a glamorous bow. He believes that LGBTQ people and their allies in this talk, in this, what I believe is an opinion piece, are ticking time bombs. I told you we were going to talk about Alan Bergen. Alan Bergen reached out to me after he was the psychologist at BYU who was really influential in conversion therapy. He did reach out to me after I published On the Record and made a public apology. In fact, this is probably one of the most heartfelt things I've ever experienced as a result of On the Record. Not only did Professor Bergen change his mind on the conversion aspect of homosexuality, his son came out, as did two of his sons came out, and so did a grandson. So he has personal lived experience of this. I want you to read his apology on the record because it's super powerful. When I published it, it went somewhat viral. A number of media sources picked it up. I did reach out wanting to know just some of my contacts in the church office building, how that was received. They said off the record that Brother Bergen is getting old in his age. At the end of On the Record is a spot that I've officially reserved for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to make an official apology to and for the many damaging teachings inflicted on the lives of the LGBTQ people and their family members and friends. Some of those people are not here to hear, they're no longer here to accept that apology. I just want, if you'll give me 1 or 2 minutes, I just want to end with one video that I thought was super powerful from a bishop.
Over the past year, I have felt promptings from the Spirit that I needed to learn all I could about these issues, to listen, finally, to many of your stories. Some of them I've read in books, some of them I've read on the internet. And as I took the time to listen, and as I took the time to learn, I began to have a mighty change of heart. But it was not without some pain. As you know very well, the stories that have been written, and your own stories, are extremely painful. Some have called it a tragedy. I call it an atrocity, what has happened. And as I read these stories and as I learned more about these issues, I began to see the emotional wounds and the scars that many of you still have today. And I seem to ask the question, where did you get these wounds? And unfortunately, the answer was in the house of my friends. And when I felt that answer, I grieved and wept. As I would, as any parent would, for their own child. You and I know that I can't speak on behalf of the church today, but I can speak on behalf of myself. And I want to tell you, if you leave here not remembering anything I have to say, remember this. I'm sorry. Deeply, deeply sorry.
All right, there's that QR code for you again if you want to download the On the Record. Again, this is, I hope that you maybe can take 1 or 2 or 10 or 30 things and start to do better. This is such a difficult topic, and it's difficult because the path that got us to the spot that we're at today was trial and error. Interestingly enough, where we're at today is the lived experiences. As more and more people come out and share their experiences, it's defying the narrative that the church created, that there is no happiness on this side of the aisle, that there are no spiritual experiences among the LGBTQ community, and that's just not true. And as more and more people come out and as more and more people share their experiences, it defies the narrative, and the church doesn't know how to react to that. The church isn't likely going to apologize for its history, but what we can do is move above and forward from that. And to the queer community, I say the very 3 things that I advocate on the podcast. You're not alone, you're not broken, and there is a community of people here to support you. I'm looking for supporters. Thank you for coming to this event. And I wish we could have got to a Q&A, but I took all your time.
Thanks so much, Kyle. I know I'm not alone in wishing we did have more time for a Q&A, but you can submit questions on the Whova app, and I think there's a way for you to go back and look at them if you want. So that's still available. So thank you so much for attending and for supporting Sunstone.